Good morning, everyone. My name is Dr. Brandon Stark. I'm the director of the UC Center of Excellence on Unmanned Aircraft System Safety. It's been my role within the past 4 years to help all of our UC students, staff, faculty navigate the drone regulatory landscape, to teach them about how to fly drones and all sorts of other fun drone-related activities. We're really excited to see DroneCamp in its 4th year. It's always one of my highlights of the summer, my summer tours. I wish we were in Monterey Bay, because out here it is 105 degrees in Merced, and it would have been a whole lot nicer to spend a week in Monterey Bay. But we'll go ahead and make do with what we have. So I've got the coveted pre-lunch spot. And very quickly, I'm going to go over a brief overview of drone regulations, and we'll spend some time talking about some drone safety and best practices. So again, if you have a question, go ahead and put it to the Q&A or to the chat window. I'll do my best to answer them, but I do recognize that there's going to be, usually is, a handful of questions coming in. I'll do my best to try to answer them, but I'd actually recommend try putting questions into the community forum. This will give me more time to give a more detailed response to any questions that you might have. And we can have someone send a link to that community forum document again. That'd be very useful. That'll be one of the best locations to put in any drone-related questions. All sorts of interesting and challenging regulatory questions. It'll be usually pretty interesting. So, the #1 rule of drones, the big drone rule, the one that should be the most obvious, but I always have to restate this every time I talk to anybody about drones. Don't do anything stupid or reckless. You wouldn't think that I have to explain this at every single presentation, but I usually end up doing, because you can just check all over YouTube and see all sorts of interesting drone videos up there. But as you are flying your drones, make sure you're just going to do something that is sane and considerate of others. I mean, don't fly your drones indoors crazily. Don't use it to spy on people. Don't use it to battle other drones out there in the skies. Don't try to pick up a flying drone with your bare hands. And definitely don't use drones to attack other people. Nonetheless, you know, we get some interesting, fun challenges with that. But some of the other drone rules, the other big 6 drone rules, all drones must be registered to a degree. I mean, all 6 of these big rules are the major big rules. There's always going to be a little bit of nuance and some exemptions to all of these. So we'll just go over these big 6, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the situations in which they may not actually apply. So you must have your drones registered. You should always use the FAA drone zone only. You generally must have a drone license unless your specific flight is exempt. And we'll go into more detail about that, because there's a lot of wiggle room. And it even just got a lot wiggler in the past 2 years with the FAA 2018 Reauthorization Act. You may need some authorizations if you're going to be operating near airports. This is such a big and challenging topic that we have an entire presentation, hour-long presentation, just about that one scheduled for Thursday. No flying farther than you can see them, which is called beyond visual line of sight. You must always be able to see and assess the risk of your drone operations at all times during the flight. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. No flying above 400 feet above ground level. There are some exemptions or exceptions to that, and we'll cover a little bit of those. And big rule number 6, no flying over people. So we'll go into these in a little bit more detail. Now, this is just the high-level summary of drone regulations. The full list of drone regulations is decently complex and a little bit challenging, lots of nuances to that. So again, I'm giving you the short answers, not the completely correct answers. But if you do have any specific questions, again, put it into that Q&A on the community forum, and we can really dive into those in detail. On our drone registration, I have to say this to all of our new drone operations. There is only one real valid drone registration site. That is fadronezone.fa.gov. Any other website that says, oh, we'll help you with drone registration, or we're going to streamline your drone registration, is fake. I come across people every now and then who's went through one of their fraudulent sites, ended up paying $150 for drone registration. The real drone registration is only $5, and honestly, it takes you about 2-3 minutes to get through. There is no real reason to look for any faster or more helpful drone registration site. The next big challenge is the drone licensing. In general, you should always start with the assumption that you will need a license. Correct, this is only applying to just US FAA regulations. There's a whole other fun set of challenges for international regulations that's another 2-3 hour long presentation in and of itself. But if you do have a question about international regulations, again, the community forum would be the best place to ask them. So back to the drone license. You should always start with the assumption that you will need a drone license. But you will find that there are many times that you may be exempt from drone licenses. But they can be a little bit limited. So the most common exemption from the drone license is if you're flying for recreational purposes. This was previously known as the Model Aircraft Regulations. 2018, they changed the rules. Model aircraft as a legal term no longer exists. Now it's only for drones being operated in a recreational purpose. The purpose for this regulatory change is they're putting everything into this unmanned aircraft bucket and then just changing whether or not it fits into a specific purpose for the regulatory scheme, rather than making a odd distinction between this is a fun toy drone and a commercial drone. So now they're all into one big bucket, and the regulations change depending on why you're flying. If you're flying for this limited recreational purposes set of regulations, you must abide by the programming of a community-based organization set of safety guidelines. Now, you can find many of these online. The Academy of Model Aeronautics is one of the biggest, most well-known CBO. In general, you'll find that their rules and safety guidelines tend to be a lot stricter than Part 107. That's generally because they prefer that people fly only and exclusively in either their AMA fields or in generally empty fields with defined safety buffers and safety requirements. So if you can abide by all the regulations for the exception for limited recreational operations, including abiding by any of the safety guidelines by, say, the AMA, I do not need a Part 107 license, but only when you have that exception. For many people who just want to fly around, in their park or at an AMA field for recreational purposes, this is a good, common sense set of rules. But they've added a fun set of new exemptions for this with the 2018 regulatory change. Now, student activity, your students, doesn't matter what grade, middle school, high school, college, student activity has always been classified as a recreational pursuit. And so the students have never needed a license for their own educational purposes. With a change in 2018, for the purposes of drone regulations, educational or research purposes is now considered recreational. as an exemption for institutes of higher education. And these educational research purposes include instruction of students, academic or research-related uses, activities by the institution as part of research projects, or other academic activities approved by the institution. Meaning, if I abide by the regulations for the exception for limited recreational operations, and it fits into one of these 4 categories as an institute of higher education, you may not need a Part 107 license. But remember, not all academic or educational activities can be done in compliance with the exception for limited recreational operations. You'll find that there are some research projects and some research activities which you would not be able to do under the limited recreational exemption, in which case you would still need that 107 license. So in general, you should always start with the assumption that you'll need that 107 license, and then try to finagle to see if you can fit into one of these categories. Now, I'd always recommend to get the 107 license because the 107 license covers everything. It's only when you're doing these special individual flight activities that you may be exempt from requiring a license. So when would you need a license, or when could you fit into that recreational exception? It's a pretty nuanced list, and I've tried to condense it down into something that I can put into just one slide. So if you're flying under 107, you'll need that drone license, but you can fly for any purpose: recreation, research, commercial, and you are given the authority to fly only when it is safe. It means that you are entrusted with the ability to make that safety risk assessment to make that determination when it is safe. And if you're flying under 107, you may also request some of the special permissions of things that may not be permitted normally. Things like flying above the FAA facility map altitudes, flying beyond visual line of sight, flying over people, flying 1,000 feet above ground. There are some other additional options if you're flying under Part 107. The recreational exception does not have the licensing requirement, although there is a new shorter test coming. Who knows? They initially hoped that it would be out by December of 2019, or a bit falling behind schedule there. But it's mostly just going to be a very simple introduction to aerospace test that's going to be part of it. The recreational exception, so no license, but you're only allowed to fly for these recreational or approved educational purposes. And the assumption here is that you're only going to be flying in safe locations. This is in contrast to flying only when it is safe. See, if you're flying only in safe locations, it means you've already designated this as going to be a relatively drone safe zone. But if you're flying only when it is safe, well, now we have more options, right? Now we're just not flying only in parks, but now here we're talking about flying in urban areas and construction areas, things that aren't necessarily always going to be safe. But you're only going to be flying when it is a safe, an acceptable level of safety. One little interesting caveat to the recreational exception is that you actually can fly at night without special permission. But again, you're still limited to only flying in these safe locations. Now again, this is a very coarse summary. I can spend hours going over the nuances of these, but no one has that kind of time. So, but if you do have a very specific question, go ahead, stick it into that Q&A window, and I'd be able to answer those in a much more detailed response. In general, you should look at operating under 107, but there are some use cases where you can utilize that recreational exception. One of the unique things about that recreational exceptions for institutes of higher education is that it's actually not limited to students. Under that recreational exception, it makes no indication of students, meaning you can have your faculty, you can have your staff, your research staff, utilize this exemption, meaning some of your research staff may not need to get a 107 license if, again, you're only flying in safe locations. So lots of new options. This has been a good boon for the UC system. Many of our students are on 10-week quarters. It's not quite enough time in that 10 weeks to start a research project and get their drone license. And so utilizing this recreational exception and then making sure that they're only operating in safe locations has really allowed more students to fly. But nonetheless, there are still drone regulations to abide by. And two of the most common challenges that I've run across is visual line of sight operations and operations over humans. Right? So we're not allowed to fly outside of our visual line of sight, and we're not allowed to fly over people. These two are two of the most challenging things because we want to just be flying our drones, making the best use of them. But there's some challenges with that. So I'll go over these two in specific. There's other issues that we might have, but these are the two most common ones that I see. Visual line of sight is more than just being able to see the drone as a speck in the sky. Visual line of sight is defined as knowing the aircraft's location. They're able to determine the aircraft's attitude, altitude, and direction. And you must be able to observe the airspace for other air traffic. And you must be able to determine that your aircraft is not endangering the life or property of another. It's much bigger than just being able to see it in the sky. So in many cases, you might be able to see a speck and you go, that's probably my drone. But if you can't tell which way the nose is pointing, if you can't tell, assess the risk of anything in the airspace around it, you're not operating within visual line of sight. So while I may be able to see my Mavic 2 as a speck in the sky from 3/4 of a mile out, in practice, my Mavic 2s, I can't really fly them greater than 1,000 feet. And even shorter if I'm operating in a very messy environment. If the horizon is very messy with trees and buildings, right? And that limits my ability to assess the risk of my drone. If I can't assess the risk, I am not flying within visual line of sight. First-person view does not constitute visual line of sight. You must be able to see this unaided without any additional equipment other than eyeglasses. So here's our little stick figure diagram here. If you're operating, directly above you, that's generally good. If you're over a building and you got a little bit of a visual obstruction, say it's a building there, that's can be safe as long as you can still make that assessment. But if you're flying on the other side of a big building and you can't see the ground and you're limited in view to see the airspace horizon, that's not safe. That is not within visual line of sight. Binoculars cannot extend the range of sight either. So those of us, including myself, with poor eyesight, our visual line of sight is going to be significantly shorter than others. Some people have very good vision. I'm not one of them. So keep that in mind, your visual line of sight. You may not be able to fly 5,000 feet out there. Many cases are smaller aircraft, 500, 600, maybe 1,000 feet. In practice, I think I can do my Phantom 4 to about 1,200 feet. My Mavics to maybe 1,000 feet. Now, if I've got my fixed wing aircraft, my 10-foot wingspan fixed wing aircraft, sure, I can see that one for a mile. That thing's huge. But my little multi-rotors, no, I can't see them. The next major challenge. No operations over humans. You are not allowed to fly over people. Doesn't matter if you give them hard hats, you tell them, hey, there's a drone flying overhead. Nope, you are just not allowed to fly over other people. And even if the drone is not directly over a person, the pilot is responsible for ensuring that it will pose no undue hazard to other people or property in the event of a loss of control of the aircraft for any reason. So you really have to think about, as I'm flying, I may not be over these people on the sidewalk, but if I'm too close to that sidewalk and there's a chance that that drone can fall and hit people on the sidewalk, that's not good risk assessment. That's not going to be safe and legal. So mission planning is going to be a big step for everyone as they go through, and we'll talk a little bit more about how we plan for safety in another 20 minutes or so. Now, drone regulations, again, these are just the big ones. There are lots of other rules and regulations. It is a little bit complex, but on the other hand, compare that to, say, the driver's license test. That driver's license handbook is well over 100 pages in California, and everyone seems to be doing okay on the road. So flying a drone is going to be a little bit different. It's mostly a challenge because it's all new. We don't have a lot of interaction with drone activities prior to doing our drone activities. And so it usually catches people as a surprise. It's just how complex it is. But it's still well within reasonable for everyone to learn well. Some of the other provisions: you can fly up to 400 feet or 400 feet above the tallest man-made structure within 400 feet of the drone. So if you're flying next to a 100-foot building, you can fly up to 500 feet above ground. If you're flying next to a 1,000-foot tower, you can fly up to 1,400 feet as long as you're within 400 feet of that tower. Now, again, you still have to maintain visual line of sight, so you may not be able to go that full 1,400 feet before you lose visual line of sight. Whole bunch of rules and regulations about operations next to airports and controlled airspace. That's why we have a whole presentation just on that one on Thursday. You may only operate when visibility is greater than 3 miles, and you can't fly closer than 500 feet below or 2,000 feet horizontally from any clouds, meaning no flying through fog. For those of us in the coastal areas or even the Central Valley where we get this really dense Thule fog, right? Any time that we've got fog, it's questionable as to whether or not it's going to be safe or legal to fly. Definitely no flying through the fog. We always have to make that weather assessment. Do we have enough visibility to fly? Pre-flight assessments, risk assessments, crew briefings, equipment checks, they're all mandatory under 107. Once you get into good safety practices and habits, it becomes, just second nature to do these. But as you're just starting out, you will have to spend some time to really think about how you do these correctly. Any accident that results in a serious injury or loss of consciousness or damage of $500 or greater, you do have to report to the FAA. Now, I'll tell you, the FAA does not actually get a whole lot of accident reports. I'm going to guess that not a lot of people actually report them as they should. But nonetheless, you are mandated to do some reporting. FAA is actually not the only organization that you may have to report your accident to. You may also have to report accidents to the NTSB, depending on the severity of the crash. So this is just the FAA drone regulations in a nutshell. And if you're confused, don't worry, this is just the beginning. Oh, drone regulations. It can get a little bit complex, and there are a whole lot of changes up and coming. At least we're in something that never changes. So the big thing on the horizon is something called remote identification. This was very controversial. It caused a lot of angry rants on the internet back in February. Lots of people are talking about this one, but it's going to be really interesting. Under the proposed regulations for remote identification, all drones must be connected to the internet. Both the drone and the pilot's location is supposed to be public information, and everyone must be subscribing to a new drone ID service. Now, this has been very controversial. Who knows what it's actually going to end up like? Right now, the FAA is taking in all this information into consideration. All the feedback, primarily negative feedback. So we'll see how it actually ends up being. But keep in mind that even if remote identification does become active, remote ID would not be required on any drones for at least 3 years after it's been enacted. So I've heard rumors that they're going to try to publish the final rule in January 2021, which means you will not actually have to have remote ID on your drones until January 2024, if not longer. So there will be a lot of time for everyone to get caught up to speed with the new regulations. Many cases, especially for some of the DJI drones, it seems plausible that it would simply just be a firmware update and then subscribing to a new service. So we'll see how that goes. No one has all of the details about how it's going to be applied. At the previous proposal, it applied to everybody and everything that flew, with different types as to whether or not you could only operate in specific zones, or different types of limited remote ID or full standard ID. Lots of little nuances and details that are all currently up in the air. We don't know how it's going to go. Now, I'll say this: I'm not excited about the new remote identification rules, but I'm not seeing this as going to be the destroyer of the industry. I do not think that it will definitely cost more. It will definitely increase costs, but I'm not, overly concerned that this is going to destroy all research activity by drone use nationwide. So I think it won't be nearly as sky is falling as the ranting and raving on the internet would make it appear. After remote ID will come some of the other rules. Flying over people. Actually, that notice of proposed rulemaking for flying over people actually came out in 2018, but we won't see that rules finalized maybe till 2022. So there'll still be some times. New classification of drones about flying over people but not crowds, or flying with permission. As these new rules come into play, there will be lots of announcements, and it won't be enacted nearly as quickly as, say, 107 information will come about. Plenty of time to learn how to be compliant with all of those. But the next set is going to be beyond visual line of sight. That one's not going to come for much later. At one point, the FAA was hoping to have BVLOS regulations in place by 2020. That's very quickly slipped. I would estimate not till 2023 at the very earliest. It's going to take some time to see how remote ID is enacted and the unmanned traffic management systems of the future will be enacted. So it'll be interesting to see how all these come into place. But we also have to remember, within the US, FAA regulations are not the only regulations that you may have to comply with. So any regulatory agency can make regulations within their jurisdiction. The FAA jurisdiction is the sky and aviation support, licensing, registration, infrastructure. State and local powers include land use, trespass, including aerial trespass actually, privacy, noise, wildlife conservation, and insurance. So the state and local powers have other authorities that apply in addition to FAA regulations. So you may have to look up local, state, county, city, and private rules and regulations, because they still will apply. Now there's, again, lots of nuances and challenges to this one, and I wish I can go into all of the details. But again, it's a very deep topic. So remember, some agencies will just prohibit drone use. Now, they'll say no takeoff and landing or standing on our property while flying a drone. That's within their jurisdiction to regulate. Again, that's a land use question. Some agencies will have a UAS approval process. Many agencies will have a permitting process. If you're a researcher, you're probably familiar with getting a research permit to operate lands. Many groups are also, just adding drones as part of that permitting process. And some agencies will just allow drone use. You'll have to check and see which ones. The responsibility is always going to be on the pilot to know and comply with all applicable regulations. You may have to check the county and municipal codes. You'll check law, directors, on-site managers, they may know. But you also have to remember, never assume that just because you saw a YouTube video of someone flying a drone at the beach, that it's going to be legal for you to do so. All sorts of interesting challenges there. Local U.S. regulations. It's going to be a hit or miss. There'll be some groups who are very knowledgeable about drones. Some cities may not be as knowledgeable, and they may, be overly cautious about surveillance and privacy impacts. You may have to do some local advocacy, but I will tell you that, if you're doing this for educational purposes, and especially if you're doing it within the UC system, I'm going to tell you, don't look for loopholes. You should respect the wishes of land managers. If they don't want you flying a drone, don't go looking for loopholes. That's not how we build a good community. Education and outreach will be the most effective tools for getting access for flying your drone. And you also have to remember that, sometimes you may not get what you want. And it's an unfortunate reality that, you can't always get what you want. So that's drone rules and regulations in a nutshell. Again, just short. If you got some detailed specific questions, go ahead and throw it into the Q&A forum. Or if you got a very simple question, you can put it into the chat and I will see if I can answer that as I read through everything.
Brandon, there are some questions in the Q&A, not the forum Q&A, but the Zoom Q&A. So do you see that panel?
Okay. Yep.
Yours started about 11:01. There's some about regulation and visual line of sight, etc.
Okay. So I'll try to run through a couple of these. Flying over roads is not prohibited unless there's people on the roads or cars on the roads. You're still not allowed to fly over people. And if there are people in the cars, you're not allowed to fly over them. But again, it's not always going to be very safe to do so, so you have to make that safety assessment. It must always be the operator who is able to see the drone. You're not allowed to leave the VLOS range of the operator. You can have additional spotters around, but the operator must always be able to see the drone. Operator can look down, can look around, but the operator can't. The drone can't leave the operator's range of visual sight. There is no internet clearinghouse of local regulations. It's terrible. You're just going to have to look for them up as they go. For getting the 107 exam, some testing centers are open, other testing centers are still closed. The shorter test, again, is only for the recreational operations. Recreational operations, including some of the academic or educational ones, you currently don't have to take the shorter test. The shorter test has not actually been enacted yet. The shorter test is expected to be an online training rather than an in-person one. So if you can fit under the academic or educational exemptions, I would go ahead and go for that. If you're concerned about getting your 107 having to take that at a testing site and the COVID risk there.
Do you
Okay,
have a recommended FAA Part 107 study guide? Somebody asks.
there is an FAA study guide materials. You can find plenty of this stuff online. Um, there's no real shortage of training materials online for 107 exams. I can't vouch for the quality for any of them, but many of them are available. The FAA does have some resources. Um, the FAA says that on average, people study for this exam for about 20 hours of self-study, and 90% of the people will pass it on the first try. So as long as you put in the hours to study for that, you should do fine. For the biggest challenge that many people have with the 107 exam is going to be the airspace test. The airspace, learning how to read the airspace maps. Airspace maps look very different than regular maps, and so it's like learning a whole new language.
There's another question about, does remote ID apply to small hobby drones or model aircraft used under recreational exception?
As of now, the proposed rules is yes, it applies to everything. But that is, something that's going to be up in the air as the remote ID shakes out. There is no medical certificate required for 107. And in fact, 107 does not require a hands-on component. It is purely a knowledge test. You study the material, you get asked 60 questions, and as long as you answer 40 of them correctly, you'll pass. There is no hands-on skill. You don't actually even need to know how to fly a drone to get your drone license.
A couple of folks in the chat window have been commenting on the remote pilot app. I use that one to study, and I found it good, and a lot of other people are like it. And there's another recommendation for King's Flight School. I don't know anything about that, but there's some folks commenting on this chat window.
Yeah, there's definitely no shortage
Yeah.
of training material for the Part 107. But so now to switch over to some of the safety side of things. Safety and legal and safe are not synonyms. Just because you follow the letter of the law does not mean you're guaranteed to be safe, and vice versa. You really do have to think about legal compliance and safety compliance. They're interrelated, but they're not equivalent. Safety I like to think about in terms of, this is a really good diagram. Safety is at the end of a chain. In fact, safety is only as strong as the chain links that it's comprised of. You need to be ready, the environment needs to be ready, and the machine needs to be ready for safety. Drone laws will help strengthen that environmental link and set some parameters for the man and the machine, but it is not sufficient to strengthen that entire safety chain. Safety is not a singular challenge. You will have to minimize a multitude of different risks. So I have some 3 key safety practices that I'm going to talk about from a safety perspective: systematic mission planning, crew resource management, and planning for emergencies. And there's lots of things that, again, I could talk about drone safety for hours, but I think I've only got another 8 minutes to go through, so I will see how fast I can talk. Mission planning and planning for safety. There's always going to be risks. There's going to be risks to the drone, and there's going to be risks to the public. One is clearly going to be more important for you to minimize than the other. Always be prepared to ditch the drone in order to maintain a safe environment. But as you're planning for safety, there's no reason that you can't be systematic in how you do that. I like to make sure that there's always a process that you go through as you look and plan your mission. So this is one of my 8-step systematic mission planning guides. We'll talk about this more in some of the other workshops as well. This is just kind of one of the ways that I teach my students. This is how you put together a good plan. You'll start off by printing out a map of your area. You'll identify what you're actually trying to get to and the best visual angles. Mark any vertical surfaces, any towers, any power lines, trees. Then look for any ground obstructions, fences, gates, buildings, structures, anything that might impede access. Then identify any potential access points, pedestrian walkways, bike paths, building doors, access points. And then from that, now you've got some information for you to design and select a launch and recovery site that can be reasonably secured. You can mark your priority access points and place UAS ground crew to help do crowd control. You can redirect people, and then you can start to evaluate this one. And then you'll assess, is this going to be safe enough? And if not, well, then you'll have to iterate. Then you'll go through the cycle a couple times. In some of our operations, if you're out in the middle of nowhere, the systematic mission planning steps is going to be pretty straightforward. But if you're talking about operations in a more urban, talking about flying on campus or, along a busy road, you're going to want to go through this step by step so you don't accidentally forget something, right? You might be too focused on avoiding flying over the sidewalks, but completely miss that you've got power lines in that same area. So, make this a systematic process as you go. But as you're going through this, you should always think about, how do drones fall? 3 types of major falls. Your drone will either have a power failure, in which case it's just going to go straight down, sometimes with a little bit of directional motion. It's either going to fly away, it'll drift in a direction, slowly losing altitude, but generally gaining in speed. And then an obstacle collision will just hits a wall and goes straight down. Those are the 3 things that you're going to go through. In a no wind situation, your drone is just going to go straight down. But when do we actually fly when there's actually no wind? Not too often. So keep in mind that even if there's some wind out there and your drone's being pushed around a bit, it's basically a physics problem of how far that drone may travel laterally, depending on how high you are. So in some cases, if you're flying at 50 feet and you've got enough wind to push your drone around 3 miles an hour, your drone's going to travel around 8 feet from where it was. More if it had any momentum in that same direction. On a windy day, it might travel as much as 20 feet in a power loss situation. So these are the things that you should keep in mind as you start planning your mission. The general rule of thumb, safety buffers, always a good idea. Your safety buffer should take into account the wind levels and your motions during your operations near sensitive locations. I like to do parallel tracks against the object, so if I have any sort of power loss situation, my momentum is keeping me moving parallel to a sensitive location rather than into a sensitive location. And a general rule of thumb, just a very quick, dirty comparison, to establish a safety buffer of around 1/4 of your flight altitude, or for the really windy day, maybe up to 1/2 of your flying altitude. So if you're flying at 100 feet, you should maintain a safety buffer between your flight area and any sensitive locations of around 25 feet. More or less, depending on weather conditions, the size, and the type of mission that you're doing. That'll help you with your systematic mission planning, because you can use that information to help you identify your areas and your reasonably secured locations. Crew resource management is another key safety aspect. In fact, it's so important that we're going to spend an entire hour talking about that one on visual observers tomorrow, I think. So always bring a helper if you can. You never know when you're going to need an extra hand out on the field, someone to call 911, someone to help wrangle cows away from your flying site to help keep you awake, or even just to watch the sky. This is a very important safety measure, crew resource management. So we'll talk more about this on Tuesday when we talk about visual observers. Almost always you should bring a visual observers. And one of the most key aspects about being a visual observer is monitoring for intruding air traffic. How do you actually monitor for intruding air traffic? Always be vigilant and alert. Always listen. 9 out of 10 times you will hear an aircraft approach long before you see it. And if you hear something and you can't see it immediately, scan the horizon first in the direction of sound. The most critical threats that you're going to have to deal with are going to be aircraft flying at the horizon, because those are the ones at the low enough altitude that may impact your flight operations. If you hear a plane and you look up and you can see it up in the sky, if you're looking straight up, it's not a threat. It's either not a threat or it's too late. Right? So scan the horizon first. If you don't see anything on the horizon, kind of go back and forth until you can actually see it. Make sure that you also communicate on what you see and what you don't see. If you can't see the aircraft, you hear it, but you can't see it, you should make sure that you tell your crew that. Because someone, your pilot might assume that you're tracking that, and you need to have that communication. So we're going to talk more about that one on our visual observer training, as well as our operations in controlled airspace. The last key safety, emergency management. Emergency management always starts with planning. Always pre-plan to solve the most common scenarios. But remember, only in rare situations are you going to have enough time to consult a manual. So make sure that your action plans are short, simple, and you've got your entire team knowing what you need to do. Here's my top 10 most common emergency plans to make, what to do in these 10 different scenarios. Non-participant enters the flight area, if you need to land immediately, a flyaway situation, a loss of telemetry, a loss of GPS, what happens, or what do you need to do if the weather changes on you? What do you need to do if you collide with a hazard? What happens if there's a fire? What happens if the pilot collapses? Or what happens if an aircraft comes into your airspace? These are all plans that you should have in place and be able to share with your crew before you start flying. Most important, again, with that emergency management, is that pre-flight briefing. This is your opportunity to share your information, your plan with your ground crew, your visual observers, anyone else that you might have with you to help. A good plan is something that you can communicate effectively. So I usually like to break this down into 5 major forms. Here's a little template that you might utilize. Make it a step-by-step process. Give specific action plans and always includes a post-incident set of instructions. So here's an example of a lost link. If your drone loses your link, here's the 5 steps that you need to do. Maintain visual contact. Communicate the situation to the team. Verify, right? Check the state, check the mode, the flight path, and the altitude, and check that the transmitter is on. Then you have your actions. You'll send your ground crew to alert the flight area. You'll tell your visual observer to contact air traffic control if necessary. And your pilot will run after the drone and attempt to reestablish connection. And then post-incident, make sure, again, you document everything and that you are able to recover your telemetry logs. So you should come up with an emergency action plan for the 10 most common scenarios that you may encounter while you're in the field. So very quick, these are my 3 key safety recommendations as you start this pathway down the drone world. As you gain more experience, you'll find plenty of other tips and tricks. I'm really happy to share with you everything that we've learned. Again, throw any questions that you might have into the Q&A on the community forum. Be able to spend some time answering those types of questions, and we'll have some more presentations, visual observers, operations in controlled airspace, and flying at night as well. And we'll go into some of these more advanced topics throughout the week. But for many of you who are doing operations in the field, this is something that I have to share. Because I think about this particular webcomic every time I go out into the field, the Starbucks drone delivery service. I do a lot of my flight operations in the fields behind UC Merced. It feels so remote out there, but really you're like less than 1,000 feet away from major campus, and I'm thinking, You know, wouldn't it be nice if I could just have my water delivered to me while I'm out in the field? But no, I can't wait for drone delivery. It's going to be interesting. And it's going to be even more interesting, you know, combining all of our drone delivery services with our research applications and all sorts of other interesting challenges in the future. So we'll go ahead and end there. Plenty of other topics up and coming. Visual observers discussion is going to be on Tuesday. We'll talk more about how to be a good visual observer, how to train your visual observers. And on Thursday, we have that advanced track on operations in controlled airspace and flying at night. So hopefully this has been a short and useful introduction to you. If you have any questions, throw them into the chat or especially onto the community forum document, and I'll be sure to answer those to the best of my ability. So I hope you enjoy the rest of DroneCamp. We've got a lot of fun topics to go through and all sorts of really good learning experiences, especially on the data management and analytics side of things.